What if the most dangerous thing about evil is how ordinary it pretends to be? This is not a story of monsters hiding in shadows. It's about men in suits, medals, and university degrees who smiled for the cameras while rewriting truth itself. For decades, we believed their lies. Some still do. But behind every myth they sold the world was a blueprint for power, dressed as propaganda. These are the 33 biggest lies Nazi leaders told, or let others tell for them. And no, they're not just lies about the past. They're warnings about the future. Before we dive in, if you love unraveling hidden histories and the dark myths people still believe, hit subscribe and join us for more. Also, curious question. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. We read every one. All right, let's begin. 1. Hitler was an uneducated nobody who stumbled into power. It's a comforting thought, isn't it? That one of the most destructive figures in modern history just wandered into infamy. A drifter, a joke that went too far. History, as written by the relieved, likes to pretend Hitler was some accident of chaos theory, a failed artist who somehow tripped into tyranny. But if you read between the bricks of the beer hall putsch, you'll find something worse than randomness: design. Hitler wasn't academically educated, sure, but he was a voracious reader, a calculated manipulator, and a charismatic speaker who knew how to weaponize shame, loss, and nostalgia like a surgeon with a scalpel. The road to the Reich wasn't stumbled upon. It was mapped, marketed, and sold with interest. And for a nation humiliated by war and debt, he was disturbingly persuasive, which makes the next lie even more perverse. 2. Hitler never knew about the Holocaust. This one is almost tender in its delusion. A dictator at the helm of a genocidal machine, somehow unaware that the engine was running, as if trains moved themselves, as if paperwork signed itself, as if people vanished into ash clouds purely by logistical coincidence. The idea that Hitler was in the dark about the Holocaust relies on imagining the Third Reich as a bureaucratic behemoth with no chain of command, a myth destroyed by hundreds of documents, first-hand testimonies, and Hitler's own speeches. He didn't just know, he demanded it, tracked it, and obsessively referred to it in euphemisms. The final solution wasn't a rogue memo, it was policy from the top. And yet, somehow, the myth persists, because people still want monsters to be separate from men. Which brings us to the next piece of historical fan fiction. Strange how much history hinges on what people choose to believe, isn't it? If you're into peeling back the layers of these myths, subscribe and stick around. We dig deeper than the textbooks dare. And hey, while you're here, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Late night rabbit hole? Morning commute? Let us know in the comments. Now, back to it. 3. Hitler was a military genius. If by genius you mean a man who invaded Russia in the dead of winter without proper coats, then sure. Call him brilliant. The cult of Hitler's military prowess began during the war, inflated by Nazi propaganda and later by Allied analysts trying to explain how they were losing to someone so clever. But the record is clear. Hitler's grasp of strategy was emotional, erratic, and increasingly self-destructive. He ignored his generals, micromanaged battles from maps he didn't understand, and made decisions based on delusions of grandeur rather than facts on the ground. His infamous no-retreat orders turned battlefields into graveyards. In the end, it wasn't Allied brilliance that ended the war. It was Hitler's incompetence. And yet, inside the Nazi machine, some still saw him as a mastermind. Especially one man, addicted, ambitious, and grotesquely self-assured. 4. Goering was the most competent Nazi administrator. In the corporate hierarchy of evil, Hermann Goering liked to see himself as the CEO, streamlining terror, managing departments of destruction, and keeping the trains running on time. The myth of Goering's administrative brilliance came wrapped in medals, stolen art, and a deep operatic voice that sold confidence. But peel back the silk and morphine, and what you find is a man more interested in luxury than logistics. Goering's ministries were disorganized, overlapping, and riddled with corruption. He hoarded wealth, played favorites, and let policy be dictated by personal whim. His infamous 4-year plan was less a plan than a budget bloated with wishful thinking. Colleagues called him lazy behind his back when they weren't watching him fall asleep in meetings. The so-called architect of Nazi economics was more carnival barker than engineer, flamboyant, bloated, and always in costume. But when it came to brutality, Goering didn't just endorse it, he institutionalized it. 5. Goering opposed brutality. Ah yes, the compassionate Goering, a man who, according to some post-war myths, recoiled from the regime's darkest crimes and sought a more civilized path. A claim about as stable as one of his jewel-encrusted uniforms. Goering was one of the earliest architects of Nazi repression. He didn't inherit the Gestapo. He created it. He greenlit the first concentration camps, not reluctantly, but with administrative pride. When violence served his political image, he embraced it. When it didn't, he distanced himself, not out of conscience, but calculation. Later in the war, Goering projected a softer persona, hoping to curry favor with the West, but it was all theater. He understood the optics of appearing moderate, especially when the regime began to implode. Strip away the revisionism, and you see a man not haunted by cruelty, but deeply invested in its profitability. And speaking of profit, let's talk about the coldest bureaucrat of them all. 6. Himmler was a desk-bound bureaucrat, not a killer. The wire-rimmed glasses, the awkward posture, the preference for files over front lines. Heinrich Himmler looked like a man better suited to running a post office than orchestrating atrocities. And that's precisely what made the myth of his distance so durable. To many, Himmler was the quiet paper pusher, signing memos, stamping documents, and letting the real monsters get their hands dirty. But this wasn't some detached manager. Himmler didn't just approve the SS's crimes. He shaped its ideology, recruited its zealots, and visited its killing grounds. He gave speeches about racial purity with clinical conviction. He believed in the mission, systematized it, and elevated murder to ritual. This wasn't detached administration. It was devotion. The desk was just a stage. Himmler wore the robes of control, not with guilt, but with purpose. And yet, even in this house of horrors, some figures were so wildly out of their depth that not even the Nazis took them seriously. 7. Ribbentrop was a skilled diplomat. To believe Joachim von Ribbentrop was a skilled diplomat is like calling a bull in a china shop an interior designer. Yes, he wore fine suits. Yes, he shook hands in foreign capitals. But beneath the polished exterior was a man so out of his depth that even other Nazis rolled their eyes behind his back. Ribbentrop wasn't chosen for his intellect. He was chosen for his loyalty and his willingness to echo Hitler's fantasies without question. His diplomatic strategies often backfired, alienating potential allies and antagonizing neutrals. The infamous Nazi-Soviet pact? That was less genius negotiation than temporary desperation, and it collapsed spectacularly. British officials who met him called him pompous, clueless, and irritatingly arrogant. Inside Nazi circles, he was mocked as a man who misunderstood both foreign cultures and basic nuance. But unlike Ribbentrop, the next figure didn't just misunderstand truth, he obliterated it entirely. 8. Goebbels simply reported the news. Ah yes, Joseph Goebbels, that humble newsman. Just a journalist with a government job, telling the public what they needed to know. Carefully, responsibly, objectively. Or at least that's the lie some tried to tell when the cameras were off and the consequences rolled in. In reality, Goebbels didn't report the news. He wrote the script. He built the stage. He locked the doors. His Ministry of Propaganda wasn't a newsroom. It was a psychological war machine that blurred reality, rewrote facts, and turned fiction into patriotic gospel. Films, radio, schoolbooks, music, everything passed through his ideological filter. He didn't just spin lies. He molded national consciousness around them. His greatest talent wasn't communication, it was corrosion. He understood the emotional plumbing of a population and flooded it with poison, and when the world collapsed, he dragged his family with him. But the most haunting part? He wasn't alone in this descent into fanaticism. 9. Goebbels and his wife killed their children out of mercy. This is one of those post-war myths that tries to wrap horror in a blanket of twisted compassion. The story goes that Joseph and Magda Goebbels ended their children's lives because they couldn't bear to let them live in a world without Nazism, as if it were a mercy, as if their actions came from some warped place of love. But the truth, while less dramatic, is even more disturbing. The Goebbels didn't act out of despair, they acted out of belief. They were true believers to the very end, refusing to imagine a future without the regime they helped create. Their choice wasn't a tragic act of parental sorrow. It was ideological purity taken to its logical, horrifying extreme. And while Goebbels poisoned the soul of a nation, others within the Nazi leadership lost their grip in entirely different ways. One of them even tried to fly peace across the Channel. 10. Hess flew to Scotland on a peace mission driven by sanity. Rudolf Hess's solo flight to Scotland is often framed like a dramatic gamble by a calm, rational man seeking harmony, a lone dove breaking from the hawk's nest. But peel back the myth, and you find a figure spiraling into his own mind long before takeoff. Hess had grown increasingly paranoid, isolated, and obsessed with mystical ideas that made even other Nazis uncomfortable. His flight wasn't a diplomatic mission. It was a last-ditch crusade born from delusion, not strategy. He believed he could charm the British into peace by sheer force of misplaced conviction, as if geopolitics hinged on enthusiasm alone. Instead, he crash-landed into history as a symbol of the regime's unraveling mental landscape. And while Hess drifted into fantasy, another man crafted one of the most successful personal myths in post-war history. 11. Albert Speer was the good Nazi. Albert Speer polished his reputation with the precision of a man designing a marble facade, smooth, elegant, and carefully hiding load-bearing guilt. After the war, he performed remorse like a well-rehearsed monologue, presenting himself as the cultured architect who simply didn't know what the machine he built was doing. Many believed him. Some still do. But documents, testimony, and his own correspondence reveal a far darker truth. Speer wasn't a detached technocrat. He was a key engineer of exploitation. His armaments empire ran on forced labor, and he was far more aware of the human toll than he ever admitted publicly. The good Nazi myth survives because people love the idea of a villain with a conscience. It's comforting. But Speer's conscience was selective, strategic, and conveniently timed. And speaking of men who preferred obedience over integrity, the next figure practically turned agreement into a career. 12. Keitel was a capable general. Wilhelm Keitel's military reputation owes more to his uniform than his judgment. Nicknamed Lackytel, a pun meaning, yes, Keitel, he was known for agreeing with Hitler even when the room froze in disbelief. Keitel wasn't a strategist, he was an amplifier. Orders came down and he nodded. Changes were suggested and he nodded. Catastrophic decisions rolled through high command like boulders, and he nodded again. His loyalty wasn't courage. It was compliance dressed in medals. He signed directives that violated military ethics and common sense, enabling policies he barely questioned. In meetings, generals groaned when he spoke, knowing his recommendations were usually whatever Hitler had said 5 minutes earlier. And yet, Keitel's passivity paved the way for someone even more dangerous, another officer who didn't just nod, but eagerly put pen to paper in the service of destruction. 13. Jodl was only a staff officer. Alfred Jodl liked to present himself as a pen-pushing soldier, far removed from the moral rot of the Nazi leadership, a loyal officer, just doing his job. But Jodl didn't just write memos, he signed away lives. As chief of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht, he was instrumental in executing Hitler's most criminal military orders, including the infamous Commissar Order, which mandated the execution of Soviet political officers. He wasn't dragged along by history, he helped steer it into the abyss. At Nuremberg, he tried to fall back on the just following orders defense, hoping the polished exterior of professionalism would save him. But the paper trail was too thick, too direct. Jodl's pen was dipped in obedience, yes, but also in blood. And while he served the military machine, another man climbed its ranks through ideology, not battlefield merit. 14. Kaltenbrunner masterminded the Holocaust. Ernst Kaltenbrunner had the face of a villain in a Cold War spy film, towering, scarred, and menacing. So when the trials came, many were quick to pin the worst crimes of the SS on him. He was the head of the Reich Main Security Office after all. But here's the catch. By the time Kaltenbrunner took over in 1943, much of the Holocaust's architecture was already in motion. The camps were running, the trains were moving, the machinery was built. Kaltenbrunner didn't invent the system. He inherited it, and then expanded it with even greater efficiency. His role was less that of an architect and more of a ruthless maintenance man. But by overstating his mastermind status, people conveniently ignored those who laid the foundation before him. Like the man many Nazis feared more than they admired, the cold operator who set the blueprint in motion. 15. Heydrich was universally beloved by Germans. To the outside world, Reinhard Heydrich was often painted as the perfect Nazi, tall, intelligent, athletic, even musically gifted. Propaganda made him into a kind of Aryan demigod, and after his death, the regime mythologized him even further. But beneath the polished mask was a man many within the Nazi inner circle loathed. He was feared, yes. Respected for his efficiency, sure. But loved? Not even close. Heydrich wielded power like a scalpel, carving out enemies, real or imagined, and using surveillance to build a web of paranoia that even his colleagues couldn't escape. Rivals distrusted him, subordinates feared him, and even Hitler found him unnerving. The myth of admiration was carefully manufactured because fear doesn't sell well in memorials. And yet, while Heydrich played puppet master, another figure pretended he had cut the strings, claiming, after the fact, to have resisted what he once helped design. 16. Halder resisted Hitler's criminal orders. Franz Halder's post-war memoirs painted him as the reluctant insider, the military man who clashed with Hitler, kept his hands clean, and quietly hoped for the Führer's downfall. It's a tidy story, and Halder told it well, but historical records suggest otherwise. While Halder did eventually fall out with Hitler and was dismissed in 1942, his early role was far more complicit than he liked to admit. As chief of the Army General Staff, Halder helped plan the invasions of Poland and the Soviet Union, operations that were riddled with atrocities and driven by ideological goals he didn't oppose at the time. His disagreements with Hitler were more about tactics than morals. He wasn't resisting genocide, he was resisting bad management. And while Halder tried to rewrite his legacy with ink, another Nazi tried to dress his in robes and Latin quotations. 17. Hans Frank was a cultured lawyer who brought order to Poland. Hans Frank's resume was dripping with academic credentials. He spoke in legalese, quoted Goethe, and referred to himself as the Governor-General of occupied Poland, as if he were a gentleman administrator overseeing a colonial province. But beneath the pomp was one of the most brutal overlords in Nazi-occupied Europe. Frank's governance brought anything but order. He oversaw forced labor, mass displacement, starvation policies, and the systematic destruction of Polish Jewry. His legal background didn't civilize him. It gave him the tools to institutionalize terror. He wasn't merely following orders, he embellished them. Frank liked to present himself as the thinking man's Nazi, the reluctant philosopher in a sea of thugs. But the statistics he left behind tell a different story. And speaking of indoctrination masked as protection, the next figure built his legacy on weaponizing youth. 18. Von Schirach protected German youth. Baldur von Schirach marketed himself as the protector of Germany's children, a cultural leader shaping young minds for a better tomorrow. It sounded almost noble, if you didn't look too closely at what protection meant under the swastika. As head of the Hitler Youth, von Schirach wasn't shielding the next generation. He was militarizing them. His job was to turn children into tools, emotionally severed from their families, reprogrammed to follow orders, and groomed to fight and die for a cause they barely understood. This wasn't youth leadership. It was psychological conscription. His speeches dripped with faux sincerity, but his actions hollowed out a generation. And while von Schirach weaponized adolescence, another official was busy proving that naval rank was no shield against ideological rot. 19. Dönitz had no role in Nazism aside from naval command. Karl Dönitz often gets treated like a technical officer caught in the wrong regime, a submarine commander who somehow floated to the surface of history without getting his hands dirty. But the truth is less seaworthy. Dönitz wasn't just a military man, he was a willing participant in Nazi ideology. He praised Hitler in speeches, endorsed anti-Semitic policies within the Navy, and expressed admiration for the Führer even after the regime collapsed. When Hitler died, Dönitz was the man he named as successor, not exactly the honor you'd give to someone politically neutral. His post-war attempts to portray himself as an apolitical sailor ignored the ideological oaths he swore and the authoritarian system he helped maintain. And while Dönitz navigated the waters of denial, another officer was issuing orders that turned war into something far uglier. 20. Reichenau was a clean, apolitical general. Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau was long portrayed as a professional soldier, loyal to Germany, but untouched by the ideological fever infecting the Nazi elite. After all, he wore a uniform, not a party armband. But uniforms lie. Reichenau wasn't apolitical. He was enthusiastic. His infamous Reichenau Order openly encouraged German troops to treat Jews and civilians in occupied territories not as people, but as part of an ideological enemy. He fused Nazi doctrine with military directives, effectively weaponizing the Wehrmacht's respectability to mask war crimes as military necessity. His troops followed his tone, and atrocities followed them. Reichenau wasn't reluctantly complicit. He was proudly aligned. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht finds one of its dirtiest footprints in his command. And as Reichenau played ideological general, another man, far less known but arguably more brutal, was turning occupation into extermination. 21. Erich Koch was just an incompetent administrator in Ukraine. If Erich Koch was incompetent, it wasn't for lack of trying. It was because his brutality often outweighed his logic. As Reichskommissar of Ukraine, Koch presided over one of the most savage occupation regimes of the war. But post-war narratives tried to soften his legacy by painting him as an over-promoted bureaucrat who didn't understand local governance. That's misleading. Koch understood perfectly what was being asked of him, and he delivered it with fanatical zeal. He blocked even modest attempts to gain support from Ukrainians, preferring domination over diplomacy. His policies weren't just harsh, they were deliberately dehumanizing. Under his rule, the region became a case study in ideological colonization through cruelty. And while Koch's reign was vicious, it was also structured, a reminder that law and order, in the wrong hands, can serve chaos. 22. Thierack modernized German justice. Curtailing civil liberties under the guise of efficiency is an old trick, and Otto Thierack was a master of it. As Minister of Justice, he rebranded brutality as reform, presenting himself as the man who would streamline Germany's courts for the modern age. In reality, he turned the justice system into a conveyor belt for political persecution. Thierack didn't modernize, it weaponized. He introduced fast-track courts, restructured legal oversight to eliminate dissent, and handed over prisoners to the SS for special treatment, a euphemism that barely hid its lethal outcome. The courtroom became an assembly line of death, with verdicts dictated by ideology, not law. His brand of modernization had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with extermination. And while Thierack corrupted the law, another so-called fringe figure corrupted something even more dangerous: belief. 23. Streicher was a harmless propagandist. Julius Streicher was often dismissed as the regime's village idiot, a loud, vulgar provocateur whose newspaper, Der Stürmer, was too cartoonish to be taken seriously. But this caricature conceals the real danger Streicher posed. He wasn't harmless. He was influential. His publication didn't just echo Nazi anti-Semitism. It amplified it with obsessive rage and grotesque persistence. Streicher didn't write policy, but he helped prepare the emotional ground for it. He made hatred feel ordinary, even righteous, in the eyes of the everyday reader. His headlines screamed ideology into the public square until silence became complicity. After the war, many tried to claim he was too ridiculous to matter. But mobs don't need philosophers. They need cheerleaders. And while Streicher infected the culture, another man took a very different path, cloaking atrocity in the language of construction. 24. Fritz Todt only built roads. The image of Fritz Todt is clean and industrial, a civil engineer with grand blueprints and a slide rule, designing highways and dreaming of infrastructure. To some, he was the regime's technocrat, apolitical, efficient, focused on concrete. But Todt's roads were paved with forced labor and strategic intent. As Minister for Armaments and founder of Organization Todt, he oversaw massive construction projects that relied heavily on the exploitation of prisoners, conscripts, and occupied populations. His autobahns weren't just travel routes, they were arteries of militarization. Todt wasn't detached from Nazi ideology. He was integral to its logistics. His legacy is often sanitized by steel and cement, but his work supported one of the most brutal regimes in history. And while Todt built with stone, others built with terror, especially one Gauleiter who turned an entire region into a test site for racial domination. 25. Albert Forster was more moderate than other Gauleiters. Albert Forster had a reputation problem. Too brutal for post-war defenders, yet too polished for the typical image of a Nazi terror lord. Some tried to cast him as relatively moderate, a less radical Gauleiter simply caught up in the system. But Forster's actions in Danzig, West Prussia, say otherwise. He oversaw a brutal Germanization campaign that involved ethnic cleansing, forced assimilation, and the destruction of Polish communities. His approach was ideological, not merely administrative. He didn't just enforce Nazi racial policy, he took initiative, often bypassing legal constraints to accelerate the process. What separated him from others wasn't moderation, it was how seamlessly he cloaked extremism in the language of policy. And while Forster was repainting maps with blood and bureaucracy, another Nazi was selling unity while preparing a nation for conquest. 26. Seyss-Inquart protected Austrian interests. Arthur Seyss-Inquart's name is often floated as a lawyerly figure who eased Austria's transition into the Third Reich, as if he were a diplomat trying to balance loyalties, not a collaborator orchestrating surrender. But his role in the Anschluss was clear-cut. He greased the wheels for Hitler's takeover and provided the legal scaffolding for annexation. In return, he was rewarded with brutal administrative roles in Poland and the Netherlands, where his governance included mass deportations, executions, and forced labor. Seyss-Inquart didn't protect Austria's interests. He dissolved them. His allegiance wasn't to his homeland, but to Hitler's vision. He wielded law as a weapon and rationalized cruelty as order. And while his name fades in popular memory, another man operated in the shadows with staggering effectiveness, quietly managing one of the most murderous programs in history. 27. Globoknik was a minor figure. Odilo Globoknik's name doesn't headline history books the way others do, and that's precisely the danger. Some dismiss him as a mid-level enforcer, a cog in the vast machinery of the Holocaust. In truth, Globoknik was one of its most efficient architects. He oversaw Operation Reinhard, the code name for the extermination of Polish Jews in camps like Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Under his authority, roughly 1.7 million people were murdered. This wasn't incidental. It was logistical, planned, executed with chilling precision. Globoknik wasn't a fringe operator. He was central to the deadliest phase of the Holocaust. His obscurity is not a reflection of insignificance. It's a symptom of how horror can hide behind administrative rank. And speaking of hidden hands, the man who drafted the very laws that made dictatorship legal was anything but a powerless paper pusher. 28. Wilhelm Frick was an incompetent with no real power. Wilhelm Frick often disappears into the background of Nazi history, remembered, if at all, as a dull bureaucrat who didn't quite keep up with the pace of the regime's brutality. But the myth of Frick as powerless is not only misleading, it's dangerous. As Reich Minister of the Interior, Frick authored and signed many of the regime's most foundational laws, including the Nuremberg Laws, which legally codified racial discrimination and paved the road to genocide. He was a central figure in transforming Germany from a fragile democracy into a totalitarian police state. His influence declined later in the war, yes, but only after the groundwork for dictatorship had already been poured, much of it by his own hand. Frick didn't shout speeches or wear flashy uniforms. He wielded silence like a scalpel and reshaped law into a tool of exclusion. And while Frick rewrote legal definitions, another man rewrote military identity itself. 29. Gottlob Berger was simply an SS recruiter. The term recruiter makes Gottlob Berger sound like a glorified HR officer, someone you might expect to see handing out brochures at a job fair, not building a multinational paramilitary force from scratch. But Berger was no middle manager. He was the architect of the Waffen-SS's massive expansion, turning it from a small ideological guard into a sprawling, combat-ready machine infused with Nazi doctrine. Berger didn't just enlist soldiers, he industrialized loyalty. He actively scouted foreign volunteers, indoctrinated them, and created pathways for them to join what became one of the most ideologically driven and brutal fighting forces in the Nazi arsenal. His reach extended far beyond recruitment. He helped shape the SS as a political army, answerable not to military tradition but to Hitler's personal vision. And while Berger brought ideology into the battlefield, another figure worked in suits and silence, quietly positioning himself as the regime's moral escape hatch. 30. Schacht was anti-Nazi. Hjalmar Schacht styled himself as the economic brain who merely tolerated Hitler, only to later distance himself with righteous disapproval. In post-war narratives, he's often framed as a sophisticated economist who rolled his eyes through cabinet meetings and secretly loathed the fanatics. The problem is, that's only the exit strategy. Before he fell out of favor, Schacht was instrumental in stabilizing the Nazi economy, financing its rearmament, and legitimizing its regime on the international stage. He wasn't tricked or dragged. He was there early, and he stayed long enough to matter. His eventual break with Hitler came not from moral horror, but from bureaucratic disputes and power struggles. Schacht's anti-Nazi image has always relied on selective memory, carefully curated post-war interviews, and the hope that cleverness could mask complicity. And yet, compared to what came next, even Schacht's revisionism feels quaint, because the following man wasn't pretending to be sane. He was just pretending to be irrelevant. 31. Robert Ley was just a clownish drunk. Robert Ley's legacy has often been reduced to a caricature, slurred speeches, gaudy uniforms, and erratic behavior that made him the butt of jokes even among fellow Nazis. It's tempting to dismiss him as comic relief in a grim story. But behind the alcoholic absurdity was a deeply dangerous man. As head of the German Labor Front, Ley dismantled trade unions, seized workers' assets, and created a system where dissent meant destitution, or worse. He turned workplaces into ideological training grounds, mixing nationalism with forced loyalty. His so-called strength through joy programs were less about leisure and more about control. Drunk or not, Ley knew exactly what he was building. A labor apparatus that served the Reich's war machine and silenced millions. His incompetence was overstated because it made his crimes easier to stomach. But the next figure didn't even need chaos to hide behind. He worked best in quiet coordination. 32. Hans Lammers was a powerless bureaucrat. Hans Lammers rarely raised his voice. He didn't grandstand or terrorize in public. But as head of the Reich Chancellery, he was one of the most connected men in the Nazi regime. Lammers wasn't powerless. He was the switchboard operator of totalitarianism. Every major decree, appointment, and cross-ministerial order filtered through his office. He ensured continuity, avoided conflict between rival Nazi agencies, and smoothed over bureaucratic snarls that might have slowed the machinery of repression. Lammers didn't command armies or run camps, but he made sure the paperwork got to the right desk. That kind of coordination doesn't scream in the history books, but it whispers through every efficient atrocity. After the war, he played the usual card. He was just a clerk, but his fingerprints were on everything. Still, for all his behind-the-scenes power, the ideological foundations he helped carry forward were laid by even earlier voices, ones that whispered poison into the party's soul. 33. Dietrich Eckart and Rosenberg were fringe ideologues. They weren't commanders. They didn't run ministries or oversee conquests. And yet Dietrich Eckart and Alfred Rosenberg were two of the most influential figures in the ideological shaping of Nazism. Dismissing them as fringe thinkers is like calling a match irrelevant because it's not the fire. Eckart, a poet and playwright, was one of Hitler's early mentors, feeding him mystical nationalism, cultural resentment, and a warped sense of destiny. Rosenberg, often labeled dull or overly academic, authored some of the core racial theories that were later operationalized into law and policy. His book, The Myth of the 20th Century, was treated like scripture within the party's intellectual circles. These men didn't kill with weapons, they killed with ideas. They built the vocabulary of hate that others would later weaponize. And sometimes, the most enduring lies come not from what they did, but from how easily people forget they were ever taken seriously.